We all love a good bargain, but there's a massive difference between clipping grocery coupons and DIYing a structural roof repair to dodge a contractor's fee. Today, we're honoring 10 absolute financial masterminds who literally died to save pocket change. Do not replicate these budget hacks unless your retirement plan relies on a life insurance payout. 1. Interstate 90 on a blisteringly hot afternoon is absolutely no place for discount automotive experiments. Sitting dangerously on the shoulder was a battered Honda Civic with a blown right tire, piloted by Greg, a man whose wallet was held shut by the gravitational pull of a dying star. To his aggressively warped mind, spending $60 on a tow truck was a mortal sin, and dropping $15 for a patch kit was deeply offensive to his core identity. Pneumatic tires are a marvel of engineering, strictly requiring internal air pressure to keep the rubber bead sealed tightly against the metal rim. Greg, however, possessed a degree in discount aisle delusion and outright rejected these fundamental laws of physics. Rummaging through his trunk, he bypassed the spare tire he was too lazy to mount and produced a half-empty can of industrial polyurethane expanding foam. The stuff used to seal a drafty window frame, not physically support a 2-ton metal box hurtling down a highway. With the smug satisfaction of a man aggressively outsmarting basic science, he partially unseated the tire bead and pumped foam inside and held the trigger until the sagging tire bulged with a horrifying yellow mass. At first glance, it looked like a triumph of redneck ingenuity. The tire took on a lumpy, misshapen form, just enough to look usable at a glance, and Greg proudly merged back into active traffic, mentally spending the $80 he just hoarded. But here is the inescapable reality of expanding foam. It is 90% trapped air bubbles wrapped in a fragile, brittle chemical webbing. It has absolutely zero structural integrity under load. As Greg pushed his speedometer past 65 miles an hour, the intense friction of the sun-baked asphalt rapidly heated up his incredibly stupid makeshift filling. Inside the spinning tire, millions of tiny polyurethane bubbles were violently crushed into a dense, completely useless yellow powder by the sheer, grinding weight of the vehicle. The crucial internal volume didn't just slowly leak, it catastrophically vanished in a matter of minutes. Approaching a sweeping curve, Greg casually turned the steering wheel, fully expecting the car to follow the road like it had every day before. Instead, the suddenly empty, unsupported tire began to deform and slip on the rim, the car lurching violently to one side with an ear-piercing screech. The bare alloy wheel dug directly into the asphalt like a giant high-speed metal pizza cutter. The rim dug into the asphalt, jerking the car violently and sending it into an uncontrolled spin. Greg went from driving a commuter car to piloting a low-altitude centrifuge in roughly 2 seconds, firmly embedding his budget-friendly sedan upside down into the trunk of a massive oak tree. The Highway Patrol's accident report clinically noted the cause of death as massive blunt force trauma, though an acute case of terminal cheapness would have been far more medically accurate. He literally traded his mortal existence to save the equivalent of a mid-tier dinner at a chain restaurant. And the absolute pinnacle of tragic irony? Investigators later found that the initial puncture causing the flat was a tiny finishing nail. A standard plug from any local gas station would have cost exactly $10. He died aggressively defending a $10 bill. 2. Bob was the kind of guy who would drive 45 minutes across town to save 11 cents on a gallon of gas, burning $6 of fuel in the process and calling it a win. So when he desperately wanted to run pneumatic tools in his garage and a quick trip to the hardware store revealed that a heavy-duty air compressor carried a price tag of $300, his financial survival instincts kicked into full, catastrophic overdrive. His incredibly flawed, budget-friendly solution was to scavenge the county landfill until he victoriously unearthed a heavily rusted, discarded commercial propane cylinder. His master plan was to haphazardly weld an air intake valve directly onto this decaying metal relic, transforming it into a high-capacity air tank for the low cost of absolutely $0. Now, if you are attempting to repurpose a pressurized vessel that previously held highly flammable gas, the non-negotiable bare minimum safety requirement is paying a certified professional $50 to chemically purge and steam clean the interior. Bob, operating purely on the fiscal instincts of a man who reuses paper towels, scoffed violently at this service. He simply twisted the brass valve open, heard no hissing sound, and officially declared the rusted cylinder magically empty and perfectly safe for high-temperature arc welding. This is a fatal misunderstanding of basic chemistry. Liquid propane, along with the intensely foul-smelling chemical additive mercaptan, does not magically vanish just because the pressure drops. Those highly volatile hydrocarbons aggressively seep deep into the microscopic, porous layers of the heavy internal iron oxide scale lining the inside of the tank. Bob had not found an empty steel cylinder. He had casually dragged a dormant, highly concentrated fuel-air explosive device directly into his poorly ventilated suburban garage. Wearing a cracked welding mask and a smug grin of financial satisfaction, Bob powered up his second-hand arc welder. He clamped the grounding wire, placed a brass air fitting directly against the compromised steel wall, and enthusiastically struck an electrical arc. The very first spark of 3,000-degree molten metal effortlessly burned completely through the thin, rusted steel barrier. The extreme localized heat instantly vaporized the trapped, highly volatile propane residue resting deep inside those microscopic pores. With absolutely nowhere for the rapidly expanding, superheated gases to safely vent, the internal pressure skyrocketed to catastrophic levels faster than a human nerve could register pain. The compromised cylinder didn't just pop. It violently detonated with the apocalyptic, earth-shattering force of a catastrophic pressure failure. The sheer concussive shock wave instantly blew the garage doors completely off their tracks, while heavy, jagged pieces of flying steel converting Bob into a cautionary tale and a surprisingly large debris field. He successfully dodged a $300 hardware store invoice, but in his desperate quest to save a fistful of cash, he entirely vaporized himself and leveled his own property. 3. Have you ever stared at a $300 plumbing bill and thought, you know what? I could easily handle hazardous biological waste management on my own? That was the exact fatal thought process of Gary, a stubbornly frugal homeowner whose absolute refusal to pay for professional sanitation services directly orchestrated his own repulsive demise. He lived on a sprawling rural property with a massive underground septic tank that was desperately crying out for a pumped evacuation. The local sanitation company quoted him a perfectly reasonable $300 to safely suck out the accumulated toxic horrors of the past 5 years. Gary, treating this standard fee like an armed daylight robbery, abruptly hung up the phone. His idiotic, budget-friendly counterproposal was purely manual labor. He marched into his backyard armed with cheap rubber gloves, a plastic bucket tied to a frayed nylon rope, and an ego completely untethered from reality. Here is a vital chemistry lesson Gary desperately needed before playing plumber. A sealed underground tank filled with decomposing human waste does not just sit there peacefully like a harmless mud puddle. It aggressively acts as a hyper-efficient anaerobic digestion chamber. This relentless bacterial breakdown constantly generates a terrifying concoction of deadly gases, the absolute worst of the bunch being hydrogen sulfide. At low concentrations, hydrogen sulfide smells exactly like violently rotten eggs, providing a helpful, nauseating warning to back the hell away. However, Gary's neglected tank had been silently festering and building immense chemical pressure for over half a decade. At these massively high concentrations, the toxic gas doesn't just stink, it instantly paralyzes the delicate olfactory nerves inside the human nose. You don't smell a single foul thing. Your brain simply stops registering the incoming lethal threat entirely. Gary, completely unaware that he was essentially unsealing a subterranean chemical weapon, grabbed a heavy iron crowbar and heaved the concrete lid off the lawn. He grabbed his trusty bucket, leaned his upper body completely over the gaping abyss, and eagerly took one deep, preparatory breath of the surprisingly scentless air rapidly rising from the black void below. That single inhalation contained enough concentrated hydrogen sulfide to instantly shut down his entire central nervous system like a blown electrical fuse. There was no theatrical coughing fit, no panicked struggle for oxygen, and certainly no time to reflect on his terrible financial decisions. Gary's brain essentially blue-screened in a fraction of a millisecond. His eyes rolled directly into the back of his skull. His knees completely gave out, and he immediately tumbled headfirst into the violently toxic biohazard sludge waiting hungrily below. He was completely unconscious long before his forehead ever slapped against the murky surface of the bubbling sewage, inevitably drowning in the exact horrific substance he stubbornly refused to pay someone else to safely remove. 4. Have you ever met someone so intensely paranoid about spending money that they genuinely treat a basic safety inspection like a coordinated home invasion on their bank account? Allow me to introduce Dave, a man who viewed his beat-up sedan the way a pirate views a stolen galleon. It runs until it physically cannot, and any port that charges for repairs is the enemy. A high-pitched metallic screeching sound had been emanating from his front wheels for a solid 2 weeks, an idiot-proof warning feature specifically engineered by automotive manufacturers to scream that your brake pads have completely disintegrated. A standard brake job would have typically cost Dave around $150, a perfectly reasonable industry-standard price to ensure your 2-ton metal commuter missile can actually stop before causing a catastrophic multi-car pileup. Dave, however, was deeply committed to his personal conspiracy theory that certified mechanics were a shadowy guild of greasy, coveralled con artists, inventing completely fictional automotive diseases just to drain his checking account dry. He absolutely refused to be scammed by what he unironically called the deep state braking industry. His thought process was terrifyingly simple, yet spectacularly wrong. What do you do when a household door hinge squeaks? You aggressively lubricate it. Therefore, according to Dave's discount auto repair thesis, if a critical suspension part is loudly squealing, it clearly just needs to be generously oiled until it shuts up. Bypassing his toolbox, Dave grabbed a massive aerosol can of heavy-duty, silicone-based penetrating lubricant. Without removing the wheels, he aimed the little red straw through the spokes and began frantically spraying the slick chemical directly onto his exposed steel brake rotors. He emptied half the can, ensuring every square inch of the braking mechanism was dripping with a friction-destroying petroleum compound. Dave then proudly took his rolling death trap for a test drive. Miraculously, as he backed out of his driveway at 3 miles an hour, the annoying squeak was completely gone. Dave was euphoric, crowning himself a mechanical genius who outsmarted a global industry for the cost of a $6 can of spray lube. Riding a massive high of frugal arrogance, he merged onto the interstate, pushing his freshly oiled vehicle up to 70 miles an hour. The horrific reality of his cost-saving measure remained hidden until he took a steep off-ramp leading to a busy intersection at the bottom of a hill. See, what Dave's dollar store brain failed to comprehend is that automotive braking is based entirely on generating massive amounts of mechanical friction to convert kinetic energy into heat. Dave had essentially greased his shoes before stepping onto an ice rink. As he approached stationary traffic and slammed his foot down on the brake pedal, the hydraulic calipers flawlessly squeezed the pads together. But thanks to his liberal application of high-grade lube, they simply glided effortlessly over the slick steel rotors. There was absolutely zero friction and zero deceleration. Dave blew past the stopped cars, his brake pedal pinned to the floorboards in absolute terror before violently launching his car over a curb. He plowed head-on into a reinforced concrete bridge abutment at highway speeds, instantly removing himself from the gene pool. He died because he fundamentally misunderstood that the single most important part of a stopping vehicle is the very friction he had just paid $6 to violently eliminate. 5. Painting the 20-foot eaves of a 2-story suburban stucco fortress is a tedious quest that strictly requires stable, professionally welded steel scaffolding. Arthur, however, viewed the local hardware store's rental department as a personal insult to his masculinity and his sacred bank account. A normal, self-preserving member of society would naturally drop $50 to rent proper industrial scaffolding for the weekend to avoid shattering their pelvis into a jigsaw puzzle. But Arthur operated on a wildly dangerous fiscal wavelength. Why pay for equipment designed to keep human beings alive when your water-damaged garage is full of garbage begging to be repurposed into a death trap? His spectacularly flawed architectural vision involved placing 2 aluminum ladders 8 feet apart and bridging that terrifying gap with a battered piece of recycled particle board. Particle board is a wonderful invention if you are assembling cheap living room furniture that will never hold anything heavier than a scented candle. It is essentially coarse sawdust squeezed together by cheap chemical glue and blind optimism. More importantly, Arthur's cursed piece of scrap had spent the last 3 humid winters leaning against a leaky garage wall, absorbing ambient moisture like a giant wooden sponge. Hardwood loses nearly half of its tensile strength when wet, but particle board doesn't just weaken, it fundamentally disintegrates on a molecular level. Completely ignorant of these material sciences, our frugal hero hoisted a sloshing, heavy bucket of exterior paint and began his doomed ascent. He stepped off the safety of the aluminum rungs and planted his boots squarely onto the exact dead center of his sagging, soggy death bridge. The physics at play here were spectacularly unforgiving. He had essentially created a massive, doomed lever, concentrating 200 pounds of stubborn cheapskate and wet paint onto the single most vulnerable point of the span. There was no warning groan of distressed timber, no polite splintering sound to suggest impending doom, just immediate, catastrophic failure. 1 second, Arthur was dragging his roller across the stucco, gloating internally about the $50 he had just kept out of the hands of the corporate tool rental fat cats. The very next fraction of a second, the decaying particle board completely surrendered to gravity with the sharp, violent crack of a gunshot. The makeshift bridge instantly snapped cleanly in half, immediately converting Arthur from a proud, budget-conscious homeowner into a screaming, paint-covered, airborne projectile on a 20-foot express elevator straight to the concrete. He experienced one brief, terrifying moment of weightlessness before making a sudden, extremely permanent introduction to his own unforgiving concrete driveway. The massive impact instantly permanently shut down his central nervous system, guaranteeing his final thoughts were furious calculations about the rising cost of an ambulance ride. He was found resting in an expanding puddle of shattered pride and high-gloss Navajo white trim paint. Tucked neatly in his wallet was a fully punched loyalty rewards card for that exact hardware store. He was literally one single rental away from a completely free weekend of safe steel scaffolding. 6. Richard treated printed expiration dates the way most people treat horoscopes. Mildly entertaining fiction with absolutely zero authority over his life decisions. A doomsday prepper-level cheapskate, he viewed the entire concept of food spoilage as an elaborate corporate scam designed exclusively to trick honest consumers into throwing away perfectly good inventory. His kitchen pantry was essentially a horrifying time capsule of fiercely discounted non-perishables, a terrifying museum dedicated to generic brand sodium and questionable nutritional choices. Now, let me ask you a serious question. What is the oldest thing currently sitting in the back of your cupboard? A stale box of crackers? Maybe some questionable pasta? Well, while enthusiastically reorganizing his chaotic shelves to make room for a new haul of clearance aisle bulk rice, our violently frugal hero unearthed a deeply unsettling artifact. Buried in the very deepest, dustiest corner sat a heavily rusted can of off-brand beef stew that had officially expired during an entirely different presidential administration. Any normal, rational, self-preserving human being with a pulse and a basic instinct for survival would immediately identify this terrifying metallic cylinder as an active biological weapon and launch it directly into the nearest hazardous waste dumpster. The can wasn't just old, it was visibly and violently deformed, bulging outward at both the top and the bottom like a tightly overinflated metal balloon. To anyone with a basic understanding of food safety, a bulging tin can is the absolute red flag for botulism. The internal pressure is caused by the uncontrolled multiplication of Clostridium botulinum, an incredibly resilient microscopic organism that thrives in oxygen-free environments. As this horrifying bacteria feasts on the decaying organic matter locked inside, it relentlessly releases gas as a byproduct, alongside botulinum toxin, the single most lethal naturally occurring organic neurotoxin known to modern science. A microscopic fraction of a gram of this invisible poison could wipe out a town. Richard, however, stared at this swollen nightmare cylinder and didn't see a bacterial time bomb. With his twisted, stingy logic, he actually perceived the extreme swelling as bonus volume, genuinely believing he was getting extra stew for his money. Refusing to let $1.50 go to waste, He grabbed a manual can opener and aggressively punctured the taut metal lid. The compromised tin immediately hissed loudly like an angry cobra, expelling a foul, sour odor into the kitchen air. Did this terrifying sensory warning stop our frugal hero? Absolutely not. Richard stubbornly poured the bubbling, gelatinous sludge into a saucepan, barely heated it to a lukewarm temperature, and choked down the entire bowl out of sheer financial spite. He literally forced himself to consume the most dangerous poison on Earth to prove a point to an imaginary supermarket executive. Unfortunately for Richard, botulism does not strike you down instantly like a cinematic heart attack. It is a creeping, agonizing, and inescapable biological shutdown. Over the next 48 hours, the lethal neurotoxin systematically attacked his central nervous system. It started with blurred vision, moved aggressively into slurred speech, and rapidly progressed into a total, descending muscular paralysis. By the second night, the cheap man was entirely immobilized in his bed, wide awake in sheer panic as the toxin reached his respiratory system. His respiratory system permanently clocked out, and Richard's body quietly shut down like a clearance aisle appliance with a voided warranty. When the coroner finally unraveled the medical mystery 2 days later, they discovered the mutated, empty soup can proudly sitting right on top of his kitchen trash. Richard successfully saved exactly $1.50, paying for his discounted meal with a horrifyingly slow, entirely preventable death. 7. The humble blue plastic tarp is designed to cover stacked firewood, not substitute for a legitimate $2,000 roof repair. But Frank firmly believed that licensed roofing contractors were a predatory syndicate designed to separate the working class from their hard-earned cash. It was late autumn, and his 2-story suburban home had developed a nasty, persistent leak directly over his master bedroom. Now, a rational adult who valued their property and their life would immediately call a professional, brace for a standard $2,000 repair bill, and sleep soundly under a watertight ceiling. Frank, however, possessed a master's degree in extreme, logic-defying cheapness and viewed this structural failure as a personal challenge to his DIY supremacy. His brilliantly thrifty solution involved marching down to the local hardware store and purchasing the absolute largest, cheapest, blue plastic tarp he could legally buy for exactly $22. His architectural stroke of genius was to simply drape this massive plastic bandage over the sloped peak of his roof. But here is where his budget-conscious engineering took a disastrous turn into lethal territory. Nailing the tarp down would damage his existing shingles, and buying proper industrial roofing cement was entirely out of the question for a man who rigorously washed and reused plastic Ziploc bags. Instead, Frank decided to rely on gravity, hauling 6 massive, 35-pound concrete cinder blocks up his rickety extension ladder. He meticulously placed these heavy, highly abrasive blocks along the very bottom edges of the tarp on the steep incline of the roof, firmly believing their sheer dead weight would be enough to hold the slick plastic sheet against the elements. Frank then descended to his backyard, cracked open a heavily discounted domestic beer, and proudly stood on his patio looking straight up at his masterpiece. He positioned himself directly beneath the edge of the roof, practically vibrating with the self-congratulatory glow of a man who just successfully cheated the system out of thousands of dollars. Unfortunately for Frank, he had completely ignored the fundamental laws of aerodynamics. A massive plastic tarp sitting on a roof isn't just a cover. From a physics standpoint, it is essentially a gigantic, highly efficient sail waiting for a breeze. As Frank took a triumphant sip of his lukewarm beverage, a sudden, powerful, 30-mile-per-hour gust of wind swept across his neighborhood. The aggressive wind immediately caught the poorly secured, overhanging lip of the blue plastic, violently rushing underneath it. In one violent instant, the entire tarp inflated exactly like a massive, high-altitude parachute. The sudden, explosive, upward kinetic energy generated by the trapped air was exponentially stronger than the static friction of smooth concrete sitting on slippery plastic. The wind viciously snapped the tarp upward, violently whipping the heavy plastic edge over the gutter and effortlessly launching one of those massive, 35-pound cinder blocks straight down from the second-story roof like a dropped anvil. Frank, still staring upward with a smug grin of extreme financial satisfaction plastered across his face, barely had enough time to register the heavy shadow blocking out the sun. The concrete block made a direct, catastrophic, and instantly fatal impact with his skull, driving him into the patio with the force of a falling meteor. The coroner's report read like a masterclass in tragic, poetic irony. The stubbornly frugal homeowner had literally been crushed to death by the exact discounted materials he had foolishly utilized to protect his own house. He aggressively dodged a $2,000 invoice, only to hand his surviving family a $10,000 funeral bill. 8. The mandatory 80% fill limit on global propane tanks is not a polite suggestion. It is a vital, non-negotiable law of thermodynamics. Stan, a relentlessly cheap hustler, possessed unauthorized access to a commercial refilling station and viewed this critical safety buffer as 20% of empty space that he wasn't aggressively capitalizing on. Refusing to let government bureaucrats dictate his fuel capacity, he entirely bypassed the safety bleeder valve, manually overriding the system to forcefully pump liquid propane into the cylinder until it was filled to absolute 100% maximum capacity. He literally topped it off like a glass of cheap tap water, managing to squeeze in exactly $1 extra worth of pressurized gas. Practically glowing with the self-satisfied energy of a man who just cheated thermodynamics, Stan carelessly tossed the dangerously overfilled heavy steel cylinder directly into the fully enclosed trunk of his dark-colored sedan. It was a blisteringly hot, completely cloudless July afternoon, and rather than driving straight home, Stan decided to pull into a massive big-box store parking lot to leisurely browse the discount aisles for 2 hours. Inside the baking oven of his locked car trunk, temperatures rapidly soared well past 140 degrees. And this is where Stan's bargain-hunting hobby collides head-on with hydrostatic pressure. Liquid propane expands relentlessly as it absorbs extreme heat, but unlike a compressible gas, a liquid fundamentally cannot be compressed. Because Stan had greedily eliminated the crucial, empty vapor space, the rapidly swelling liquid fuel had absolutely nowhere left to go. It began to physically press outward against the unyielding steel walls of the cylinder with unimaginable, rapidly multiplying hydrostatic force. This incredible liquid pressure effortlessly exceeds the structural bursting limit of standard quarter-inch carbon steel. Just as Stan proudly strolled out of the store, casually sipping a massive discount soda, the metal cylinder inside his trunk finally surrendered to the physics he ignored. The steel violently ruptured, instantly unleashing a massive, hyper-pressurized cloud of highly flammable vapor into the hot car. A single rogue spark from the vehicle's overheated electrical system immediately found the gas cloud. The resulting explosion was utterly apocalyptic, a massive, deafening fireball that violently shattered store windows. Stan was instantly vaporized in the parking lot, aggressively removed from existence simply because he stubbornly refused to leave 85 cents worth of empty space inside a pressurized metal torpedo. 9. The dead of a brutally freezing January is absolutely not the time to engage in a hostile negotiation with your local utility company over a $12 late fee. Yet, Eugene intentionally allowed his natural gas supply to be legally shut off out of pure, unadulterated financial spite. Rather than swallow his massive, completely unwarranted pride and simply write a small check to get his central heating turned back on, Eugene confidently pivoted to a spectacularly dangerous, off-grid survival strategy. He marched to his snowy backyard, grabbed his incredibly cheap, rusted outdoor charcoal grill, and triumphantly dragged it directly inside his master bedroom. To Eugene's dangerously uneducated mind, fire is just fire, and heat is just heat. He generously filled the metal basin with a massive mound of discount charcoal briquettes, squirted an alarming amount of lighter fluid onto the pile, and successfully ignited a roaring fire right next to his nightstand. And because Eugene's brain operated on the same thermal logic as a microwave burrito, maximum heat, minimum ventilation, he had already sealed the bedroom tighter than a submarine hatch. Every possible source of fresh air had been eliminated in his relentless quest to trap every last degree of warmth inside. What Eugene catastrophically failed to Google is that burning charcoal is a wildly inefficient combustion process that massively consumes ambient oxygen while relentlessly pumping out staggering, lethal volumes of carbon monoxide gas. Unlike the heavily scented hydrogen sulfide of a rotting septic tank, Carbon monoxide is the ultimate silent assassin. It is completely invisible, entirely tasteless, and lacks absolutely any detectable odor whatsoever. More terrifyingly, carbon monoxide binds to the hemoglobin in human blood roughly 200 times faster and far more aggressively than life-sustaining oxygen. As Eugene proudly slipped under his heavy winter blankets, feeling incredibly smug about completely outsmarting the greedy corporate utility executives, his bedroom was rapidly transforming into a highly efficient, oxygen-deprived slumber chamber. He didn't experience any violent coughing fits, a burning sensation in his throat, or a sudden frantic realization that he was suffocating. The toxic gas silently flooded his bloodstream, completely starving his brain and major organs of oxygen while his lungs foolishly continued to breathe the poisoned air. Eugene simply drifted off into a deeply warm, incredibly comfortable, and permanently fatal sleep. When the extremely bewildered authorities finally breached his sealed bedroom a week later, they found him peacefully tucked into bed, having perfectly and painlessly drifted off forever. He had tragically surrendered his entire life in a deeply misguided, fatally stubborn crusade to save roughly $12, completely unaware that his brilliant financial victory was actually a brutally efficient one-way ticket to the afterlife. 10. Illegally scavenging discarded wooden telephone poles from rural backroads is a terrible way to source winter firewood, primarily because they are soaked in toxic, cancer-causing creosote. Chuck, a fiercely stubborn man, was entirely too focused on the fact that the wood was free to care about minor details like long-term respiratory failure. He fundamentally believed that paying legitimate businesses for firewood was a massive scam, making this his primary heating strategy. His ultimate prize for the evening was exactly one of these massive, chemical-soaked timbers, which he unceremoniously dragged back to his driveway. To dismantle this toxic beast, he wielded a terrifyingly ancient chainsaw that hadn't seen a drop of oil or a metal sharpening file since the late 1990s. The cutting chain was so incredibly dull it essentially just violently vibrated against the wood rather than cutting it. A brand new replacement chain costs roughly $20, but Chuck viewed basic tool maintenance as a profound financial weakness. Instead of spending cash, he relied entirely on brute force, aggressively straddling the toxic log and throwing his entire upper body weight directly onto the struggling machine. But here is the critical, fatally stupid detail. A few weeks prior, Chuck had purposefully unscrewed and completely removed the front plastic handguard, the essential mechanical component that actively triggers the emergency chain brake. He claimed this critical, life-saving safety feature blocked his line of sight and just got in the way. This is an unforgivable sin in forestry. Telephone poles are notoriously riddled with massive, hidden metal hardware, from climbing steps to deeply embedded industrial lag bolts. As Chuck aggressively leaned his torso over the screaming engine, furiously forcing the dull teeth deeper into the timber, the upper tip of the spinning blade violently collided head-on with a solid, half-inch galvanized steel staple buried in the grain. This immediately triggers a terrifying physical phenomenon known as chainsaw kickback. The immense kinetic energy of the screaming motor, entirely unable to cut through the solid steel, instantly and violently rejects the wood, forcefully redirecting all that aggressive rotational power backward. The heavy saw instantly kicks straight up in a vicious, vertical arc. Without the protective plastic handguard there to strike his wrist and instantly lock the spinning blade, there was absolutely nothing to halt the momentum. The screaming, full-throttle chainsaw arced backward at roughly 100 miles an hour, and Chuck's story ended exactly the way every single safety manual ever written warned it would, instantly logging him out of the mortal realm. He had actively dismantled his only line of defense to save a few seconds of minor inconvenience, violently trading his mortal existence for absolutely free, highly toxic firewood that he never even got the chance to proudly burn. Here is a serious debate for the comments. Are these fatal cheapskates victims of extreme modern capitalism forcing them to save pennies? Or is this just pure, unfiltered natural selection weeding out the idiots? Drop your verdict below. If you enjoyed watching people spectacularly fail at basic economics, hit subscribe and drop a like. It's a completely free transaction.